Good afternoon. Welcome to the John Adams. My name is Tracy Metz. You may already know that the John Adams Institute brings the best and the brightest of American thinking to the Netherlands, be it in person or online. We are now online today, together with you, at the lovely venue in the OBA, the Openbare Bibliotheek Amsterdam, our partner. And we're very happy to be collaborating with them and to have these wonderful facilities in this lovely space. Speaking of online, check out our YouTube channel, either on YouTube or through our website. Almost all the speakers that we've hosted in the course of over 34 years now are there. It's an extraordinary resource and it's free. You can also watch our recent election events there. We discovered that online life sometimes does have advantages. For example, on the day after the elections, we were able to share the thoughts and the observations of not one speaker, live in the Netherlands, but 5 speakers online, including George Packer and our former director, Russell Shorto. Today, we're welcoming Ian Buruma, truly one of the outstanding thinkers and writers in both the US and the Netherlands. He has written extensively on Asia, on the crisis of democracy, on the rise of Islamic fundamentalism. I just heard that his book on the murder of Theo van Gogh is being republished with a new essay soon, and on the aftermath of the Second World War. He has spoken a number of times at the John Adams. The last time was about his book about his grandparents, Their Promised Land, My Grandparents in Love and War. And Bas Schalema of the OBA has very kindly gone through the library stacks and provided us with a mosaic of books from the collection of the OBA here on the table for you to enjoy. Thank you, Bas, for doing that. Ian is here today to talk about his newest book, The Churchill Complex. In it, he talks about the special relationship between the US and the UK, how it came about, or you might say how it was invented, and what it means in today's world of Trump and Brexit. If you read Dutch, I would urge you to buy the translation published by Atlas Contact, Het Churchill Complex, Opkomst en Ondergang van de Anglo-Amerikaanse Orde. It is so important that publishing houses like Atlas Contact continue to translate important books like these, and we hope you will support them. You can buy it at a discount from our other partner, the bookstore Atheneum. Now I would like to introduce you to our moderator of today, Roberta Haar. Roberta is an American and a professor of foreign policy analysis and transatlantic relations at the University College of Maastricht. And the British perspective today is represented by Andrew Gawthorpe, a university lecturer in American history at the University of Leiden. I will be receiving your questions via the laptop, via the live chat, and passing them on to our speakers. You can use the YouTube live chat of either the library or of the John Adams. Please feel free to send in your questions whenever you like. I'll be there waiting for them and pass them on to our speakers of today. Roberta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tracy, and thanks to the John Adams Institute for inviting me to moderate today and to introduce this outstanding writer and his latest work. And I think, Tracy, you have a knack for asking me to introduce books here at the John Adams Institute that have some sort of personal, deep resonation with me, as you did with the Henk Meyers book on Arthur Vandenberg. But if you indulge me a little bit, I want to share with you a few other books that, for me, are intimately linked to today. While at the same time share some personal things to illustrate Ian's achievements. My first encounter with Ian is this book here. While I was writing my PhD dissertation.
The Wages of Guilt.
Yes, The Wages of Guilt, Memories of War in Germany and Japan. And I was writing my PhD at Penn State on German and Japanese post-Cold War foreign policy. So you can see that in the early 90s, Ian and I were thinking about the same sorts of things. So now, 13 books later, I have the privilege again to enjoy a lucid, written text that's written in a very engaging way. And I have to say that I also liked your autobiographical beginning, which Ian recounts his own sighting of Churchill in London in 1958. But with my focus on transatlantic relations, the time frame that is covered in this book, the Churchill Complex, this time frame is a familiar one to me. But what I really enjoyed while reading it was this fresh interpretation of what is really a well-trodden historical period. It's an interpretation that uncovers a red thread, and maybe not a thread, it's maybe not strong enough, maybe you could say a sinew, in fact, because it's the thing that holds a foreign policy of a whole post-war period together. But at the same time, I think that there's something very honest about the foreign policy that's covered here, about the misperceptions, about the misguided turns, about the abuses of heroism and the myths. Indeed, I think there's an honesty that is often lacking in historical accounts of the period. But the second book I want to talk about today relates to the subtitle of this book, The Rise and Fall of the Special Relationship, which we just found in our previous discussion that Andy's has a different subtitle on his, so this is the British version.
Andy, what's the subtitle of yours, the American version?
It's The Curse of Being Special.
Ooh.
Has a slightly different meaning, I think, yeah.
So obviously different audiences, but I like this one, The Rise and Fall of the Special Relationship, because it relates to my own special UK-US relationship, because as Tracy said, I'm an American, but I was married. I had a 25-year relationship with a British man, an Englishman, who happened to write this book in 1985, Simon Duke, US defense bases in the United Kingdom. So it's very clear that there is a special relationship going on here. Someone who also was definitely an Englishman, but was also loved America, was deeply interested in the future of Great Britain, its foreign policy, its relationship to America, and its essential relationship to Europe, which also very much comes out in Ian's book. So I especially enjoyed knowing this about US bases in Britain, that Ian recounts the difficulties that Reagan encountered when he wanted to bomb Libya for the terrorist acts that Colonel Gaddafi committed. And of course, Reagan wanted to use the bases that were based on British soil, and it was the 25-year-old author of this book who had just finished his DPhil at Oxford that went on the BBC to explain to the British skeptical public why Thatcher was giving Reagan permission to actually fly US bombers from British soil.
This why you married him.
No, but he certainly loved America. But what I'd like to do now is to go back to this myths and heroism that I talked about, and I want to set up this that permeates your book, Ian, this myths that are attached to Churchill and Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain also is a character that's throughout this book, and that impact the narratives of the whole post-war British and American foreign policy. So I would first like to set the stage and play our first video clip and how and when these myths started.
If Great Britain goes down, Roosevelt said, all of us in all the Americas would be living at the point of a gun. Then, in early August, determined to do more for the British, Roosevelt headed out to sea for a secret rendezvous in U-boat-infested waters. Under cover of darkness, he slipped away from reporters, boarded an American warship, and headed north to meet the British battleship the Prince of Wales. On board was Winston Churchill. The course of the war would be determined by the convergence of these two extraordinary personalities.
I was told, as a deathly secret, that this meeting was going to happen. It was perfectly clear to my father, and perhaps also to the President, that of course it did matter very much whether they would see eye to eye.
Churchill, his bodyguard later reported, was as excited as a schoolboy. At stake, the Prime Minister believed, was the fate of Western civilization. The president was also on edge. He was not used to sharing the stage with any man, and Churchill was already a legend. A Roosevelt aide who knew both men worried about a clash of prima donnas. With the Navy band playing the Stars and Stripes Forever, Churchill came aboard the American ship. At last, Roosevelt said, "We've gotten together." They talked for 4 days. Two titanic egos, each taking the other's measure. Churchill was determined to bind the Americans ever more firmly to the British cause. Roosevelt was wary. He was unwilling to ask Congress for a declaration of war without the rock-solid support of the American people. But he was searching for some way to help Great Britain before it was too late.
So, if we could include Ian now in our... So, good morning to you in New York.
Good morning.
So if you could tell us, after we have set the stage now with this video clip, if you could tell us how this moment of greatest glory for the Americans and the British contained the seeds of future folly.
Well, I don't know if that was the moment of greatest glory. It was, of course, where they drew up the Atlantic Charter, which was a kind of informal blueprint for the world order as they saw it, that would follow a victory in war, and a war in which the Americans were not yet participants. Churchill very much wanted the Americans to commit themselves, but Roosevelt, for the reasons just outlined, was wary of it. Much has been made of the relationship between the two, and as though it were a very intimate friendship. I'm not sure Roosevelt didn't like Churchill the first time he met him and thought he was a snob. Nor was Roosevelt very keen on the British Empire, quite the opposite. And one of the sticking points in the Atlantic Charter was that Roosevelt very much insisted on a clause that stressed the right of peoples to independence. And Churchill did not want to include the Indians and other subjects of the British Empire in this clause. And Roosevelt did, but then let it go because he found the alliance with Britain was more important. But in any case, the alliance was forged. They did win the war with the Soviet Union. Without the Red Army, it probably couldn't have been won, or not in 5 years. And I think that your question is really about what the aftermath was of this victory. And the moment of glory was really in 1945. And I think, well, to be very succinct about it, I think that the unfortunate result was that too many US presidents saw themselves or wanted to see themselves in the sort of heroic mold of Winston Churchill, and were terrified of going down history in the way that Neville Chamberlain did because of his deal with Hitler in 1938, when he allowed the Germans to take a chunk of Czechoslovakia in return for a promise that that would be it and there would be peace. And Chamberlain has gone down history fairly or unfairly as the appeaser, the coward, and so on, and Churchill is the hero. And too many wars since World War II were started, not because of the Churchill myth, but certainly boosted by the Churchill myth and by the aspiration of too many American leaders to want to be Churchill and not Chamberlain.
And from a British perspective, what's really notable to me about this video is that it's such a nice image for us in Britain to think about Churchill and FDR next to each other, talking in a position of rough equality between the nations. But this was really the beginning of such a transfer of power and roles between these two countries, with Britain a declining superpower and America a rising superpower. And superpowers always want to have one set of rules for themselves and then one set for everyone else. And Britain was, in the decades after this moment, had to live with the fact that it no longer was the power that was setting the rules, and America was doing that. And I think that's something that Britain has really had struggled to deal with in the post-war era, and that's another thread that we see in this book and throughout this history as well.
But I wondered if you could also speak a little bit more about why appeasement seemed to, you said that too many American presidents wanted to be like Churchill, to be this heroic element. But then the opposite, or the other side of the coin of that, is this appeasement, and why it gained such preponderance, I think, also in this time frame that you're talking about. And is it linked to this concept of people like their heroes and their villains, and then somehow, even if Chamberlain wasn't really the villain, he seems to be typecast that way often as a way to not follow in what he did?
Yes, I think there are various reasons for this. One is that Hitler really was a very unusual figure, and too often all kinds of tin pot dictators have been described as though they were the Hitlers of our time, Saddam Hussein and so on, whereas they really weren't. And in 1938, the late 1930s, Churchill was one of the few leaders in Britain at the time who really saw that there was no chance of coming to a lasting agreement with Hitler, that the only thing to do with Hitler was to oppose him. And that was not a popular view at the time. I mean, it was with some people, but it was certainly not in the Conservative Party. And in normal times, somebody like Chamberlain is the preferable leader, the leader who tries to negotiate his way out of trouble, who tries to find compromise and so on. That's what you want peacetime leaders to do. Thank goodness, in May 1940, they had in Churchill a bloody-minded, romantic, rather belligerent leader who was exactly the right person for that moment. But that doesn't mean that you need somebody like that in other less fraught moments. This was in a way a unique moment in the 20th century, and normally you probably want Chamberlain's rather than Churchill's. And I think the myth that came out of all this was Hitler villain, Churchill hero, Chamberlain coward. Now, the other reason I think why Churchill had such appeal and continues to have such appeal in the United States is that he was personally more popular in America, consistently so, than the country he represented. The British were never very popular in America, and people forget, just because the Americans speak English, that it's not essentially a British-based country. I mean, at least as many immigrants came from Germany and other places. And so the sentimental attachment to Britain was never great in the United States, and certainly not in 1939 and 1940, when most Americans were opposed to joining the war on the Britain side. But Churchill himself was very popular. And I think it's partly because he was sort of the living embodiment of a self-image of the United States. The beacon on the hill, the country that has a mission to defend freedom and democracy all over the world, and so on. Now, that's one side of American foreign policy. There's also an isolationist tendency. But that interventionist tendency, I think, goes back to a rather Protestant missionary zeal that sees American values and American freedom as a universal thing that needs to be fought for and spread. And I think Churchill, to many Americans, was the kind of bulldog face of that self-image, even though, of course, he was British and not American, but his mother was American, and Churchill certainly made the most of that whenever he was in the United States.
You anticipated my next comment, because I exactly wanted to ask you that you wrote that Churchill was more popular in the US than in his own country. And I wanted to move the narrative on a little bit by looking at another popular man of the time, or in this time frame, when it was global popularity, and that's JFK, and move on to a new video clip. If we could have number 5.
A momentous meeting in Washington. Arriving at the White House by helicopter from Andrews Air Force Base is British Prime Minister Macmillan, accompanied by President Kennedy, who had gone to the airfield to welcome him. Mr. Macmillan is here for a weekend of conference with Mr. Kennedy. The meetings of the two chiefs of state are also attended by other officials. A wide range of subjects are discussed, including the possibility of informal talks with Soviet Premier Khrushchev, economic adjustment to the European common market, and Russia's responsibility for the resumption of nuclear testing. An informal break in the talks is spent strolling the lawns with Mrs. Kennedy, the British ambassador and Lady Ormsby Gore, and Carolyn's two ponies, Macaroni and Tex, who seem to be acting as unofficial greeters for all visitors to the executive mansion. Before leaving for a series of talks with Canadian Prime Minister Diefenbaker in Ottawa, Mr. Macmillan praises the partnership between his country and the United States.
It is this sense of partnership, of being able to just meet and talk things over as partners do, which makes the value of these meetings. And I'm deeply grateful to you for making it possible. And I hope that this system will continue, because I'm sure that it is the basis of a cooperation between our countries which has great value for the future of the world.
You want me to comment?
Well, first I would ask you a question first, but I think I wanted to look for it again. I think you said this is the last time there was a sense of style in the special relationship between Kennedy and Macmillan. And I like this clip also because of the ponies on the White House lawn. But perhaps you could say something about, maybe this is a little bit going broad on this particular video, but if you could say something about the resentment on both sides of the Atlantic that is papered over, I think, by this rather glamorous visit, with ponies no less. But this resentment that the UK feels about its subservience to the Americans, as well as their worry that the US was young and foolish and led by a young and foolish president, and maybe too ready, America that was too ready to contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. And even, of course, during the Cuban Missile Crisis when Kennedy was president. But it was rather shocking to see how often the Americans were thinking about using nuclear weapons during this time frame. But if you could say something about the resentment on the part of the British.
Yes, well, Churchill already, in the first clip we saw, was already aware, I think, of the growing power of the United States. And he wasn't aware quite how quickly the power of Britain was going to be diminished. But I think it was then that he said to somebody, do you think the president will like me? So he was already quite self-conscious. Macmillan uttered the famous phrase, I think it was in 1944, when he was in the Middle East. And he said to a British diplomat that Britain, the British, to the Americans, we'd be like the Greeks towards Rome. The Americans, like the Romans, are more vigorous, younger, coarser, more vulgar, more dynamic, and so on. And it was the role of the British, like the ancient Greeks, to use their old world sophistication to rein in this sort of rampant young power. And that was a way to justify the new relationship and to sort of make it more palatable to the British as well, as far as their own self-image was concerned. Now, the relationship with JFK was very interesting because even though Macmillan had that view, and that you could call it a form of resentment, he very much liked JFK, and he particularly liked the sort of youthful vigor of JFK, and JFK was, unlike his father, Joe Kennedy, an Irish American, of course, and Joe Kennedy had all the Irish American allergies towards the British and was an appeaser. He was on the side of Chamberlain. And Kennedy wrote a book about the period of appeasement. I think it was called When England Slept or something of that kind. And so he admired Macmillan as a sort of somebody who'd played an important role in World War II and was the epitome of the sort of languid English gentleman, and JFK with his contacts in high society in Britain sort of rather like that too. So there was a kind of symbiosis between the two men, a sympathy between the two men. Yes, Macmillan thought that the Americans needed to be reined in when they got sort of out of control and too enthusiastic in nuclear and other affairs, but he admired the dynamism of JFK, and JFK admired a particular fantasy of Britain. It was JFK who was the great reader of James Bond novels, and in fact met Ian Fleming, the author of James Bond, for dinner once in New York, where he received some tips on how to deal with Fidel Castro.
Did you have a comment, Andy?
Well, I think it's really interesting that Macmillan was very concerned that Kennedy, because he was an Irish-American Catholic, might be an Anglophobe and might have a problem with Britain. And we're actually hearing very similar concerns in London at the moment about Joe Biden, right? There's a lot of noises coming out of the British government that they're concerned that Biden, who's also an Irish-American Catholic, might be anti-British for this reason. And Biden didn't really help this recently when a reporter from I don't know if you saw this, but a reporter from the BBC tried to speak to him, and he said, "BBC, I'm Irish," and then just turned and walked away and wouldn't talk to the reporter. But, I mean, with Macmillan and Kennedy, they managed to work together because Britain and America do have very strong interests, that they hold together. And I think that these fears about Biden are probably somewhat overblown as well, although that does depend a little bit on how the British government acts when it comes to the Irish question in Brexit. But I think we'll probably talk about that later. But just interesting to observe that historical parallel here.
So, Andy, do you feel in this matter British as opposed to the Americans, or do you feel a Scottish sympathy for the Irish prejudices against the English?
Well, I'm from northern England and halfway between Scotland and the south, and I feel so Americanized in my views because I have an American wife and I write for American media, so I tend to take the American side in these questions, actually. And, Britain hasn't, London hasn't made it too easy to like it recently in terms of policy, so yeah, my sympathies lie elsewhere.
Except there's one little detail that I found in researching my book that I thought was fascinating and counterintuitive, which was when the Americans were feeling very ambivalent about Margaret Thatcher's Falklands War. And the question rose whether the British should be supported in this endeavor, which I think President Reagan thought was rather ridiculous. I mean, going to war over what he called a freezing rock in the Atlantic, that it was Joe Biden who said, of course we have to support Margaret Thatcher because they're British.
Yeah, I also came across this anecdote recently as well, that Joe Biden was considered to be the lead proponent of supporting Britain in Congress at the time. So someone needs to tell Nigel Farage that, because he maybe has the wrong idea about Biden's loyalties.
I think you have a very good knack for anticipating my next point, because indeed I want to talk about now this, let's say you could maybe call the high point of this Anglo-American relationship, and that is to think about the Thatcher and Reagan years. But I did want to start out with thinking about, in the next video clip that we have, about the fact that they did indeed not always agree, especially when it came to the value of empire. So let's have a look at this next clip, please, number 7.
In front of the cameras, it was all smiles.
Britain and America will stand side by side.
But the documents released today by the British National Archives reveal some tempestuous moments. After Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic Ocean in 1982, Prime Minister Thatcher launched a land and sea invasion to take them back, counting on President Reagan for support, telling him, "You are the only person who will understand." But Mr. Reagan hesitated, afraid that U.S. support would offend Argentina's Latin American allies. The relationship hit its lowest point during the Falklands War, when President Reagan kept urging the Prime Minister to negotiate a truce, a suggestion she flatly rejected.
So yes, the last question I asked you about sort of British contemptuousness or resentful of the U.S., and I did want you to comment a bit further on sort of the U.S. exasperation, on the other hand, of the U.K.'s romantic views about its empire and its Commonwealth and its past.
Yeah, of course, not everybody was exasperated. Caspar Weinberger, who was National Security Advisor, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but was very much on the side of the British. As were others. So Washington was very much divided on this for Cold War reasons. I mean, some of them, like Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was, I think, US UN ambassador, didn't want to upset the Argentinians because they were allies against what they saw as dangerous sort of communist moves in Latin America. But others thought that the British were right to insist on sovereignty when the Falklands were invaded. And after the Falklands War, Reagan was very effusive in praising Margaret Thatcher, and even, as so often on these kind of occasions, comparing her to Winston Churchill. So I don't think there was a clear American policy. I think it was very divided, and in the end, partly because of Caspar Weinberger, they actually offered the British a great deal of help, without which the British probably wouldn't have prevailed, certainly not so quickly.
Well, I was thinking of it not only during the Falklands War, but also when Truman and the whole incident, and Truman and Eisenhower in Iran. I know Truman said something like he couldn't understand how the British couldn't make a better relationship with the Iranians about the oil, about BP, or even in 56 in Suez. I think there are many instances that Americans don't quite understand this strong view that the UK has about its past and its empire and its Commonwealth.
Yes, but I think there was a lot of hypocrisy involved in many of these cases. They were quite prepared to help the British and support the British, and even want British support in intervening in the non-Western world when it suited the Americans. But they didn't want to do it, of course, for imperialist reasons. And this is the point of what people call, quote unquote, American imperialism, that if it is imperialism, it's always done, or not always, perhaps often done in name of anti-imperialism. So when the British were trying to keep their oil interests from being nationalized in Iran by Mossadegh, the Americans were not sympathetic and thought that the British were being imperialistic and so on. Then a clever British diplomat said, the way to sell this to the Americans is to say that this is a fight against communism. And very quickly the Americans came on board, and the CIA helped British intelligence undermine Mossadegh, and which led to his fall, and which had disastrous consequences for the history in Iran and the world ever since. And during the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson very much wanted the British to keep their military bases in Malaysia and other places, and didn't want the Americans to be alone in policing the world. And so I think there was an ambiguity there that, yes, the Americans, especially in the days of Truman and even more so Roosevelt, saw themselves as fighters against European empires, but later very much wanted Britain to be on the American side when they intervened with military force in Korea, Vietnam, and other places.
And I think one thing that's so interesting about this moment with the Falklands is that, so in the aftermath of World War II, the reason that Britain had been so valuable to the US as an ally was the legacy of its empire. So it had these diplomatic connections all over the world, it had intelligence assets, it knew many regions of the world that the Americans didn't know so well. But this also became a liability for the US as well when Britain tried to continue to defend these kind of global assets and interests and this vision of itself. So we saw that in Suez, we saw it in the Falklands as well. There's a great anecdote from the time of the Falklands where the British ambassador to Washington was speaking to an American official, and I think he'd only managed to be able to speak to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, so he's already kind of annoyed about that. And he says, as he speaks to this official, he seemed, this is a quote, he seemed immensely detached. I imagine that's the impression that British diplomats gave a century ago when some minor power came asking something of them. So there's just this, this incredible understanding of how the positions have changed and how difficult it is for Britain to get America to stand up for its interests in this post-war period.
All right, maybe we can speed up our chronology a little bit. Now, several times while reading, I wondered if your goal, Ian, in writing this book was to set the record straight about Churchill's views on Europe, on Churchill's internationalism, and on the values of democracy. Or I could say also Roosevelt's and their special relationship, what we started out. I wondered if you were appalled by Trump's and Boris's project of bastardization of what FDR and Churchill had, their shared internationalist goals of spreading liberalism, democracy through international organizations, through the Atlantic Charter that you talked about earlier. And of course, these are all very antithetical to Brexit. But let's see how the current president, he's still the president of the United States, and the prime minister now in the UK, how they express their views on their special relationship. So if we could have slide number 9.
Mr. President, do you have any advice from Boris Johnson on Brexit?
He needs no advice. He's the right man for the job. I've been saying that for a long time. Didn't make your predecessor very happy, but I've been saying it for a long time. He's the right man for the job.
You're on message there. I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for that. And we're looking forward to having some pretty comprehensive talks about how to take forward the relationship in all sorts of ways, particularly on trade. And we're very excited about that.
We're having very good trade talks between UK and ourselves. We're going to do a very big trade deal, bigger than we've ever had with the UK, and now they won't have at some point, they won't have the obstacle they won't have the anchor around their ankle, because that's what they had. So we're going to have some very good trade talks.
So maybe the question is then, how is that these international ideals set out in the Atlantic Charter have made way for this populist agitation against immigrants, a hugely destructive divorce from Europe, and an American president whose greatest wish is to build a wall to keep people that he does not like out?
Well, yeah, it was very shocking to me, both Brexit and the election of Donald Trump at the time, precisely because I sort of grew up, being born in the shadow of World War II at the end of 1951, grew up admiring so much of what Roosevelt and Churchill had stood for. Partly for autobiographical reasons. My maternal grandparents were British, born in Britain, but children of German Jewish immigrants. And they really thought that Churchill had saved their lives and were more British than the British and extremely patriotic. And so I idealized Britain really when I grew up by looking at it through their eyes. And by extension, the United States. And for many years, I really believed in this, to the point that in the 80s, I was still sort of a liberal hawk. I thought it was important that the Americans intervened on the side of people who aspired to more freedom against their own dictators and that kind of thing. I'm now a bit more skeptical about it, especially since the Iraq War. But I do see both Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as a kind of betrayal of everything that I grew up believing in. Now, you could say that I shouldn't have believed it in the first place, and I should have been less sentimental, and I shouldn't have been the sort of person who sheds a tear watching John Wayne and Robert Mitchum wading across the surf on the beaches of Normandy in a movie like The Longest Day and that kind of thing. I am still moved by that. But because of that sort of partly sentimental attitude, what's happened in the last decade is profoundly shocking. Now, why it happened, of course, is a complicated issue, and it's difficult to give a very glib answer to that. But it is the reason I wrote the book. I mean, it was my disillusion, if you like, that made me want to write the book.
Yeah. And just to build on that point a little bit and talk about the trade deal a little bit. So, we hear so much now about this idea of a US-UK trade deal, and something that British politicians talk about an awful lot. And I think what we need to understand that is it's much more about a desire for a political connection between the US and the UK than it is about economics. So there's this great quote that Ian mentions in the book where Winston Churchill said that if we're forced to choose between Europe and the open seas, then we'll always choose the open seas. And it's this vision of Britain as, they call it global Britain now, right? It's kind of a swashbuckling kind of global power. And so, that's what this trade deal is about. It's about giving the impression that Britain has an option other than this close alignment with the European Union, and then invoking this kind of mythical history of the relationship with America to back it up. Even though the economic impact of this deal would be tiny because the two economies are so close. And just to say one last thing, I also grew up feeling exactly the same way that Ian does about Britain and America. That's why I became so fascinated with America. What I find so strange nowadays is that the people in London who talk about these myths so much and invoke them so much don't seem to have the best interests of that relationship at heart to me, and don't seem to be engaged in a really kind of hard-headed analysis of what's in Britain's interests and what America wants from Britain, which is actually closeness still with Europe.
So why are they saying that then, Andy?
I was reflecting on this recently, and it seems to me that the sort of Conservative Party politician who considers himself the most hard-headed about international relations and thinks everyone else is a naive fool. This is the sort of person who you hear talking about the special relationship in these romantic ways, so sentimentally as well. And like Ian said, I find that discourse really moving as well. But I think that at a point it can rot our thinking a little bit, and we don't think so clearly about what actually is the basis of this relationship in concrete interests, rather than the Churchill myth, the Churchill Complex, as Ian has wrote about.
But Churchill himself may not have shared a lot of these delusions because, one of the problems is that the relationship has been much more special on the British side than on the American side. The Americans really cared much less about Britain, and it's certainly true today, than the British care about America. And the reasons why Margaret Thatcher wanted to be so close to Ronald Reagan had less to do, had something to do, and in her rhetoric she played up the Second World War and the legacy of Churchill and so on, but it had everything to do with the Cold War. That she saw America as the great power that would, with Britain as its junior partner, that would stand up to the Soviet Union. But now, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, in the end, when it comes to trade deals and even political closeness, America will look after its own interests, and those are more with the EU than they are with a Britain that's sort of floating outside the EU, which will be of much less interest to the United States. So it's all very well, even Trump disparaging Angela Merkel and Macron and others, and talking about, his fondly of his golf courses in Scotland and having dinner with the Queen at Windsor or wherever. But even he probably, if it were to come down to real trade negotiations, if he were to to be in the White House for another 4 years, which he won't, thank goodness, but probably would have not come up with a particularly good deal for the British.
Tracy, you have a question from
Indeed, and this goes back to the Cold War and the position of the powers of the UK and America and Russia. We have a question from Janet about the role in the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt that Stalin played after the war. Did they stick together as a front against Russia? What was Stalin's role in this?
The big three.
You want me to answer?
If you feel so inclined.
Well, after the war, it played no role at all because Roosevelt was dead. But it played a role in the last years of the war when the big three had these various summit meetings. And it was not at all, from Roosevelt's point of view, he was very careful not to give Stalin the impression that he and Churchill, that America and Britain were ganging up on the Soviet Union. On the contrary, towards the very end of his life, he rather bullied Churchill together with Stalin, and went out of his way to make sure that Stalin didn't get the impression that there was an Anglo-American front against him. And so I think this was a mistake, but that's the way it was. Now, after the war is a different story because there were different presidents.
Okay, that's a...
Thanks. Yeah.
We talked now about the present, and what I felt indeed, and you confirmed just your desires to write the book. But let's also now look to the future and consider America's president-elect and his relationship with the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And we have one more clip to play for this.
I congratulate President-elect Biden very much on his victory, and of course I congratulate Kamala Harris on being the first female vice president, as she will become in the history of the United States. And the United States is our closest and most important ally, and that's been the case under president after president, prime minister after prime minister. It won't change, and I look forward very much to working with President Biden and his team on a lot of crucial stuff for us in the weeks and months ahead. Tackling climate change, trade, international.
So, global Britain. It would seem, I think, Boris's initiatives are indeed that he's really trying to please and appeal to things that are important to Biden. But I also feel like that he's falling into this same trap of Britain trying to box above its way and weight. That it still wants to play this role of on the global stage, and that it's committing to Biden that we're in, we want to work with you. So my question to you then is, if you could advise them, what would you say to both leaders? What advice would you give them on how to avoid falling for the Churchill Complex myth, or even the opposite, the Chamberlain myth, in their future relations?
Well, I mean, Boris Johnson's UK doesn't have the power or the clout to fall for the Churchill myth because they're not going to start any wars. That would be on the American side. And I think one thing Biden has to be a little careful about is that a lot of the people he's brought back into government are liberal hawks who do believe in humanitarian intervention and American intervention and America's role in spreading freedom all over the world, and he has to be careful that this doesn't lead to unnecessary conflicts. Now, America is so broke that the chances of doing that are probably relatively slim. On the British side, I think it's a complete delusion to think that Britain, now sort of severed from its EU ties, could become a sort of global power again that can deal with the Americans or anybody else, the Chinese, on an equal basis. I mean, Britain can't be dismissed. It's still an important country. It's got a seat on the UN Security Council. It's got a nuclear It's got nuclear arms and so on. But it's going to be a very much diminished power. Whereas as one of the three leading countries inside the EU, they did have a lot of influence, and an influence that the Americans always wanted them to have as a kind of bridge between the EU or the European community and the United States. They've lost that now. So I think if one were to advise Boris Johnson, they've been foolish enough to leave the EU, he would be well advised not to indulge in fantasies about special relationships with Washington, but to come to a deal with the EU that's as advantageous to both sides as possible and make sure that the damage can be contained.
Of course, we don't know yet who the Secretary of Defense has not been named. I think most of the national security cabinet has been already suggested from the Biden cabinet, but we don't know who the new Secretary of Defense is. Of course, Michelle Flournoy was, her name has been out there, and she certainly would have been Hillary Clinton's first Secretary of Defense. So we don't know if the next one will be a liberal hawk or not, but I think that's very true. But my other question had to do with, indeed, U.S. views on the U.K. now that it has departed the European Union, but I think that's already been answered then.
Well, what this clip of Johnson congratulating Biden and Harris makes me think of is the history of Boris Johnson's comments about Barack Obama and his attitudes towards Donald Trump as well. So many of us probably remember that Boris Johnson was very annoyed when Barack Obama kind of made comments against Brexit, and he ascribed this to what he called Obama's ancestral dislike of Britain because of his Kenyan heritage. And, you know, this is a pretty flagrantly racist comment, and it's not something that Democrats have forgotten, actually. So Barack Obama's former spokesperson, Tommy Vitor, who's now a very, I don't think he's going to serve in the Biden administration, but he's very influential among grassroots Democrats. When Johnson congratulated Biden, Vitor said, "The shape-shifting creep weighs in. We've never forgotten the racist remarks that you made about Barack Obama, and we never will." And what I really see here is that there's this kind of clash between two different worlds. So there's always been a kind of discomfort among the British upper classes with the racial and the social diversity of the United States. And, you know, we see this in attitudes towards Meghan Markle, right? Mm-hmm. We see it in attitudes towards Barack Obama. We've seen it in attitudes towards Kamala Harris, who a British peer, Lord Kilclooney, sorry, I should say his name right, referred to her as the Indian recently in a tweet. He didn't even use her name. And, you know, the Democrats notice this, right? And they're not, you know, I think that Joe Biden's team are going to be very professional. You know, they're very experienced. They're not going to personalize diplomacy in the way that Donald Trump did. But, you know, also as America moves increasingly towards being a multicultural, multiracial society, and as the forces that Donald Trump represents seem to be in the retreat, you know, bearing in mind that Republicans have lost the last 7 of the 8 presidential elections, at least in terms of the popular vote. This is something that the British right really needs to work on, right? They need to find a different way of connecting with Americans that isn't based on this. And, you know, and it was very foolish for Boris Johnson and the Brexit class, you know, even if we take for granted that they would have been able to get real concessions and real kind of, you know, that interest looked after by Donald Trump, which I don't believe that anyway. But even if they were right, they were, you know, hitching themselves to a sinking ship, right? You know, a president who had never been above 50% popularity with his own people, who was incompetent. So, you know, this is something that Boris Johnson needs to have a good think about, I think, you know, for the future.
One last warning for Boris.
Can I say one thing? I mean, you brought up something very important that we haven't really talked about yet, which is the influence of class. And the British right wing and the Brexit right wing, even though Boris Johnson himself went to Eton, is not really an expression of the upper class. I mean, the upper class, when the upper class ruled Britain, Anthony Eden, Macmillan, and so on, they were, if anything, rather pro-European. And it was often Labour and those who represented the working class, all the way up to Jeremy Corbyn, who were rather anti-European. and have their own problems with race, as we know. Now, in America, of course, the same thing has happened. It's not the upper class anymore that runs the Republicans. When it did, the American upper class elite, the East Coast elite, were often rather Anglophile in their tendencies, like the upper class or the upper middle classes everywhere in the West. I mean, they liked, country clubs and tweed suits and horse riding and all that kind of stuff. But that's no longer the class that runs the Republican Party. It's much more a lower middle class, if anything, or people who represent the blue collar vote, who now who are the leaders on the right, and that will have an effect, and it has had an effect on Anglo-American relations too.
Can I ask a question? Yes. Ian, you said something just now about why you wanted to write this book now, that was inspired by your disillusion with Brexit and Trump. I was wondering whether in your investigation of what led up to this moment, did you learn anything new, anything surprising, or was it a confirmation of what you had already been brought up to think?
Well, it's a question you always get when you've finished a book. It's not that there's a surprising new thesis, or that something comes up which makes you think completely differently about the subject than you thought about it before. It's more in details, and I hadn't realized the extent. I knew the myth of Churchill, and I knew about it, and it's what I wanted to write about. I didn't know the extent to which Chamberlain's ghost played a part in all this, and that it surprised me somewhat that every time there was a foreign crisis and there was a question of whether the US should intervene with force, every time that happened, all the way from, and on the British side too, I mean, including Suez and the Falklands Islands, and in the American case, the Korean War, wars in the Middle East, Vietnam War, Iraq, and so on and so forth. Every time these things come up, Munich, 1938, is raised rhetorically, inevitably. And we must avoid falling into the trap of Munich. We must avoid another 1938. I hadn't realized the extent to which this particular ghost haunted post-war politics, both in Britain and in America.
It must have been interesting to discover the extent to which this entire history colored your own perception of the countries that you've lived in and feel affiliated with.
In what way?
That you realized the extent to which the Churchill myth had also influenced your own approach to the U.S. and that you really are a child of the special relationship.
Yes, in a way that is true, but I think it's my own Churchill myth probably played a larger part in my attitudes to Britain than it did to America or the special relationship. I mean, it didn't. The special relationship and the relationship with America is not something that played a huge role in my childhood. America did, and I remember my father, who was a lawyer, going to New York for business and sending me postcards of the sort of waterfront and the Empire State Building and so on. And I was fascinated by America from a very early age, but not really, I didn't think of it really in terms of the special relationship. I think that was more, so I was fascinated by America. I idealized Britain. The connection between the two was not necessarily all that dominant, except that one other aspect of all this, which we haven't mentioned, is the enormous influence on my generation of Anglo-American pop culture in the 1960s, which in some ways was as strong, perhaps, as the influence of America and Britain in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, in the 1940s, the troops came into Holland liberating the Netherlands with Glenn Miller music and Hershey bars and so on, and sexual liberation was part of it. But the same was true in the 60s and 70s when American and British rock groups invaded the West once again with promises of liberty. And that had a big effect as well.
When Andy mentioned global Britain just now, the first thing that came to my mind was swinging London.
Long time
cool
ago.
Britannia. Cool Britannia. So I think we've reached the hour. Unless we have any questions from online.
No, only from Janet. Yeah.
Okay. And we're not taking questions from the audience.
If you want to stand up and shout, then I'll repeat your question so that it's on the tape.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, and thank you for this wonderful exclusive arrangement. I want to know if you could play forward this play. We now have Biden. We're basically going to have the Pentagon is going to swing. What is the next step going to be? Where is the relationship going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Where is the relationship going in the next 5 to 10 years, Ian, now that we have Biden and Boris?
I think it'll become much less significant. I think that Britain will become less significant, less important, less in the American interest to pay too much attention to. It may still be that American presidents will still feel flattered to go horse riding at Windsor with the British monarch. Apart from that, I think Britain will become a much more provincial place, and America will pay more attention to the EU.
Which is the irony of Brexit then, because all of the rhetoric they used, Churchillian rhetoric that was used, sort of will
exactly
backfire.
the opposite effect.
Will have the opposite effect.
Well,
and is that a good way to end it?
Well, before we say goodbye, I'd like to make a couple closing remarks to draw your attention to two upcoming events at the John Adams. The first is on December 16th. We're doing an event on art and activism, looking at artists and how they look both in America and one from the Netherlands, looking at how they approach society and issues of identity, color, heritage, race, and that whole minefield between Trump and Black Lives Matter. Two artists from the United States who are both represented in the exhibition This is America at the Kunsthal KD in Amersfoort, and an artist who was in the exhibition Say It Loud in the Bonnefante Museum in Maastricht. So I think this will be a really exciting discussion. And on January 6th, we will be looking back at the elections for the Senate on the day before, on the 5th, since the elections for the Senate will tell us a lot about how much clout Biden actually has to get his legislation passed once he's in the White House in January. So hope you'll join us then. And for now, I would like to give my heartfelt thanks to Ian for being with us to talk about his newest book.
Thank you.
For Roberta Haar and Andrew Gawthorpe, and to our audience for joining us and staying loyal to us in these confusing but also exciting times. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It's a wrap.